All right. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dominica, and I would like to welcome all of you to today's lecture. And Groningen, we are the largest actually city, and every Monday we do lecture with them, but also if you want to socialize and enjoy this weekend, tomorrow we organize some trips. On this Friday, we will have some open summer and nature. And the lectures is between academics and professors and American journalists in Russia, who are joined by Joshua Yaffa, who can see right here. And he will discuss his experience as American journalist in Russia. We'll talk about how academics and artists of Alexey Navalny affects Russian society and politics. I'm very excited when I started to see all of you and about whether I really want to hand over the words to Joshua.
All right. Evening, everybody. Thank you for joining me in this conversation. Thanks for the invitation. Very glad to be with you all and talk to you about my experience in Russia over the past 10 years as a journalist. Let me start by just explaining a bit about who I am and how I got both into journalism and into Russia as a subject. I grew up in San Diego, California, so just about polar opposite, both geographically and kind of thematically or spiritually from Russia. I grew up on the Pacific Ocean with no Russian family, no Russian heritage or background, or even frankly all that much Russia interest for much of my life, or really all of my childhood. I grew up I was a child in the late 80s and early 90s, so I caught some of the later years of the Cold War and the Soviet collapse. I was still a small kid when the Soviet Union collapsed, but I think I picked up on some of that ambient interest in those events and the kind of weighty historical significance of those events, and caught the tail end of the American fascination with the great big enemy to the east, the Soviet Union, but none of that was very specific or particular, and I didn't really know all that much about Russia or what there was to be interested in Russia beyond just that most kind of surface level understanding of the place. It wasn't until I got to college where I actually developed an interest in Russia, but that too began rather spontaneously, or I would even say accidentally. I studied at a program, or rather the department I was in, the specialty was international relations, a kind of diplomatic program, perhaps not unlike the one that you're all involved in, though at the college level. So it's a 4-year program in international affairs and diplomacy, which meant that we all would have to study one language or another. So seeing as that requirement was baked into the program, I thought, why not use the opportunity to study something more interesting, more challenging? I had studied Spanish in high school, but thought if I'm going to have to spend another 4 years doing an intensive language study, why not emerge from that with something that's a bit more, frankly, just cool or interesting. That was my thoughts were sort of no more serious or well-defined than that. Why not Russian? Seemed interesting and seemed like a worthy challenge. And so I started studying Russian. Extraordinarily difficult. I don't know if there's any of you in the audience who speak Russian for family reasons or study Russian, but my heart goes out to you. It's a very difficult language to learn with very complicated grammar, though again, perhaps Dutch in this regard is not much simpler. But the grammar, as I say, first and foremost, is just the entire architecture of the language was certainly a lot for me to wrap my head around. And it wasn't until my first trip to Russia, which was still as a college student. I went on a study abroad program between my second and third years of university to St. Petersburg, where I lived with a Russian family, studied at a local institute. And that's really where, I guess you could say, my interest, obsession, love affair, I refer to it with different names myself, but that's where Russia became the topic that would go on to so far at least, defined much of my life. It was in St. Petersburg where it went from being one of the many courses I was studying in university, one of the many things I was interested in, to being the thing that I wanted to orient my time, at least my academic time, around. In St. Petersburg, this was the mid 2000s, so certainly well after the collapse of the Soviet Union, well after even the sort of chaos and frankly poverty of the 1990s, but before the top-down centralization and also the oil boom of the Putin years fully took force in St. Petersburg. So I caught it at this kind of in-between liminal period, which I think turned out to be very interesting for me, and just an interesting time to catch the city. It had the kind of freedom and even a bit of wildness, but hadn't yet become fully, let's say, kind of European, normal, predictable in ways that St. Petersburg is now, still being a very beautiful city, a city on canals, much like Amsterdam, visually beautiful. But now St. Petersburg is in some ways, a familiar European city. And back 15 years ago, it still had this air of the strange and the exotic. And I loved the shabbiness of it, the way it had this kind of a look of Venice that had fallen into a state of romantic disrepair. But it was also a grand city, difficult and romantic. And speaking of difficult and romantic, this was also a period, not exactly pre-internet, but certainly well before Skype, well before WhatsApp, very difficult to keep in touch with my family in California. I remember having to make these complicated arrangements many days in advance to have a phone call with my family in California. It was not the sort of thing where we were regularly in touch. In fact, quite the opposite. So I really had this feeling or this opportunity to disappear, as it were, in this new city and in this new country. And I think that added to the intensity of my experience, which really stuck with me. And as I said, carried with me as I returned to college. And then in the years after college, when getting back to Russia remained this real interest and priority of mine. And also, I should say that it was language that got me into Russia. Language was my kind of gateway into the place. But it was through the language that I then took an interest in studying the history, Russian literature, Russian politics. So I was one of those. And in fact, there are many of us in the Foreign Press Corps in Moscow, and we can talk about that a bit later. We came to Russia through the language, and then we came to the country, its history, its people, its culture. And then only after that did we come to journalism. In other words, as you can perhaps already tell from the short narration of my career, that I'm a Russianist first and a journalist second. Russia was my first great interest, and it was, as we'll talk about, trying to find a way to implement that those skills that I had amassed, that I came to journalism. Oftentimes, I think in other parts of the world, you see people who are trained journalists first and then arrive in a place and think about, how can they apply those journalistic skills to a new country. I'm a bit the opposite, and many of my friends and colleagues in Moscow among the Western Press Corps are also the opposite. We got into Russia first and then figured out a way to do journalism in Russia. So I traveled back and forth between Russia and the US after college and went to grad school as well, where I did ultimately study journalism in graduate school. And I would periodically visit Russia without ever really living there, but had developed some friends and knew my way around, at least Moscow and St. Petersburg, where I had been before. But it wasn't until the spring of 2012 when I decided to move to Russia full time. And I don't know, I tell this part of the story with some hesitation or even shyness, because I'm not sure it's the kind of thing I want to kind of confidently suggest to young people at the early stages of their career they model. But I quit my job at a magazine in New York, a good stable job where I was working as a junior editor at the magazine. I quit that job with no real plan and bought a one-way ticket to Moscow to try and see if I could make it as a journalist, as a foreign correspondent. The reason I did that at that moment in early 2012 was there was a period of protest in the streets of Moscow and other big cities. There had just been a parliamentary election that many observers and the public at large seemed to credibly believe had been fraudulent. Putin had just announced he was coming back for a third term, and there was a lot of discontent in the air, and it seemed like the biggest political story in Russia, well, perhaps since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Little did I know that there would be events in the following years that would be much more decisive and newsworthy and grab the world's attention even more than these protests. But at the moment, it seemed like if I didn't take this opportunity to move to Russia and try my hand at being a foreign correspondent, who knows when that opportunity would ever come my way again. So I took this decision, something between brave and reckless, and quit my job and bought the ticket and showed up in Moscow, where, as luck would have it, because of, at the time, the interest in the story, the protests were ongoing, news outlets needed coverage, I was able to find myself work. And the biggest stroke of luck at all, that has nothing to do with my talents or abilities, but really just is kind of fate smiling on me, the long-term bureau chief of the Economist magazine was going on book leave for a year and needed someone to fill in for him. I was in the right place, right time, and was able to get this job writing for the Economist. So my first sort of full-time proper job in Russia as a foreign correspondent was for the Economist. And what is the job of a foreign correspondent? Perhaps that's of interest to some of you, and I'll spend a minute just talking about, what are the requirements of the job? What is the job meant to do? What do I think the role of a foreign correspondent is? I think of it as a kind of translation job. Of course, there are professional translators who translate between languages, and I have great esteem and admiration for that profession. And in a way, some part of my job is doing literal translation of a kind that translators do with literary texts, and that oftentimes, or just about always, I'm speaking to sources and characters and people I meet in Russian, and I'm trying to translate and render their speech and their ideas and thoughts in English. So there is an element to which I am literally translating. But I also think more metaphorically, I'm translating in a broader sense that doesn't have to do just with language. I'm trying to bring the feel of a place, the backstory of a place, what's the historical baggage even that people bring to their own lives and societies, what are the debates and questions that really interest and captivate, in this case, Russian society, and how can I, on the one hand, understand those issues and debates for myself, but then explain them to a reader who isn't of the place, who doesn't know all of that context. How can I make it understandable and legible? And I think it's valuable. Well, I guess I have a certain self-interested reason to say this, because it's who I am. So I guess I'm invested, right, in my combination of kind of skills and traits and so on, hopefully being somewhat successful or advantageous for the job. But I do think it can be interesting and useful to have the eyes of an outsider in writing about a foreign country. An outsider who has knowledge of the language, who has knowledge of the history and culture and so on. But I do think those eyes of someone who grew up in Southern California, but has been living in Russia for 10 years, allows me to see certain things, see storylines, see aspects of political questions or social questions that maybe a local wouldn't necessarily see as interesting. I'm still able to see Russia through the eyes of someone who knows nothing about Russia, who's interested in the world and interested in Russia, but doesn't know the place in and out. I'd like to think, I hope that having that kind of vision for what does Russia look like, or what might it look like to someone from the outside, helps me understand, what are the stories that I should be telling readers, that readers would be interested in and find important. And what I want to do is tell a story that is very true to the local perspective. In other words, and I often do hand my stories to a Russian friend or colleague. I want the Russian friend or colleague to look at the story and say, yes, that's all, that's right. You've captured the story correctly. You've captured the essence of the debate correctly. while also having that same story be understandable and interesting and hopefully even captivating to the foreign reader. In other words, they can follow along. They don't need all sorts of background information or contextual understanding. They can just pick up the story, read it from start to finish, and understand, oh, I know what's going on here. And beyond that, I hope I'm also interested in what's going on here. The story is told in such a way where I, almost like a good piece of fiction, I want to get to the end. I want to find out what happens. So I think about two audiences for my articles. It doesn't matter if it was for the Economist back when I started writing in Moscow, or for the New Yorker, where I've been writing for the past 5 years. I want the articles to work for two audiences, effectively, metaphorically speaking, my Russian friends and my Californian friends. I want the article to pass the smell test, as it were, with the first audience. I want that first Russian audience to say, yes, you got it right. You didn't cut corners. You didn't water things down or use cliche. You really captured the nuance of the issue. And I also want the second audience, the Californian audience, to say, wow, thank you for the great story. Thank you for the insight into this place. You explained something about a foreign country that we didn't understand, but now we do. A question I get a lot, and maybe will come up in the Q&A, but I'll address it just for a moment here, is about what you might call press freedom and how it is to operate and work as a journalist in Russia, a place that justifiably is known as a very difficult environment for journalists, and indeed is. The last article I wrote for the New Yorker, which came out a couple of weeks ago, which we can talk about, is a new round of effectively repression against independent journalists using various bureaucratic and legal methods to make the practice of independent reporting that challenges state interests difficult, if not impossible. And that's always been the case, really, for certainly the last 10 years that I have lived in Russia. But I think it's worth distinguishing between the pressures and difficulties and even danger faced by Russian journalists and those faced by Western journalists, where in fact the calculus is very different. For the most part, knock on wood, us foreign correspondents are effectively left alone. We don't really pose a social or political danger to the ruling system because we write in English for foreign audiences. There are some people who read the New Yorker in Russia, and God bless them. I'm happy that we do have some readers, and I hear from people who read the New Yorker in Moscow, but it's certainly nothing like the kind of numbers that would actually represent a real political threat to the Kremlin. And so since our articles, or my articles, let's say in particular, are being read by people far away from Russia who have no real ability to influence what ultimately matters for the Kremlin, which is, can Putin and his inner circle of officials continue to hold on to power? Since nothing in the New Yorker really threatens or could even threaten that dynamic, we're largely left alone. But whereas reporting in Russian for Russian audiences does have the potential to really complicate and make difficult the life of not just Putin, but lots of other Russian officials in the system. And so that's why Russian journalists face the pressures that they do. That said, there is a thriving independent media scene. It's shrinking. It's under constant pressure. It's under even more pressure these days than it certainly was 10 years ago or even 1 year ago. Like I write about in this article, especially through the use of the so-called foreign agent law applied to Russian journalists that effectively the Kremlin doesn't like or would like to see, if not put out of business, at least have their lives become very difficult. So there are all these means of pressure that can be used and are being used against Russian journalists. And I don't want to minimize the difficulty of practicing journalism in Russia. But luckily, as things stand, for me at least, I don't really face anything like those pressures. And I, along with my colleagues who write for other Western newspapers and magazines, are effectively free to go about our business, reporting on Russia, traveling around Russia without much attention and certainly not pressure from the authorities. At a place like the New Yorker, which focuses on what you might call narrative journalism or long-form journalism, really deep investigations or features about a topic rather than writing about the day's news. We're not the New York Times, although, as the New Yorker's website expands and the metabolism of the place expands. We are doing more and more kind of quick turnaround articles that reflect the news, but in general, what we're looking to do are deeper studies and investigations and examinations of issues rather than covering the day-by-day events. That said, I am interested in, and the magazine is interested in what I might call covering news in a non-news way. In other words, whatever the big story is in Russia, it could be the protests of 2012 that I mentioned, it could be the protests of this winter that just happened, the Sochi Olympics, the annexation of Crimea, the war in Donbass, accusations of election interference, the coronavirus pandemic. Those are all big news topics that readers are interested in. The way the New Yorker might address that is to find a story within those bigger topics. I'll give just one example, and we can talk a bit more about this in the Q&A if you like. But this is actually before I came to the New Yorker. I wrote this for the New York Times Magazine, but the rules of the genre are very similar, and I think it's a good example nonetheless. During the war, or the most active phase of the war in eastern Ukraine, when Russia was propping up a kind of would-be anti-Kiev insurgency in eastern Ukraine, I wrote a long investigation that was effectively the search for a Russian soldier who had gone missing in mysterious circumstances and turned up in Ukraine, and his brother, the two of them were orphans, they grew up without parents. His brother was kind of crisscrossing both Russia and Ukraine, trying to find his brother, and the story of how this soldier, let's say, quote unquote, got lost in Ukraine. How did this Russian soldier end up crossing the border and becoming, captured in the Donbass region? Through that story, I was able, I hope, to tell the wider story of the war in Donbass, and like I said, address the news in a non-news way, not just writing about what happened in the Donbass region today or what happened in the war today, but rather here's this long story with particular characters, a particular plot line that along the way you will learn a lot about that war and why did it start and what is Russia's role in it and so on. You'll pick up all of that news information in the form of a non-news narrative story. But I also, write about Russia in ways that have nothing to do with the news, and that's a real delight and a pleasure for me. I've written about a medical train for National Geographic. This is a train that travels between very remote Russian villages that have no automobile roads, no other means of connection with the outside world other than a train line. And these villages sometimes can be 1 or 2 days train ride away from other villages. And the Russian government in this far eastern region of Russia has equipped a special train with medical equipment and doctors. And this train is a kind of clinic on the rails that travels between these remote villages and offers medical care to the villagers. And I rode along with this train for almost a month and ended up writing about it for National Geographic. And that's the kind of story that has nothing to do with the news. It's just a great story from Russia. I think along the way, I certainly, along the way on that trip, learned a lot about Russia, especially about life in the more remote regions, a story that doesn't get a lot of coverage elsewhere or otherwise in the media. And so there was no news reason why that story had to exist, but in the end, I'm glad it did, and I hope it served some interest and value for readers. There's a more recent story I wrote for the New Yorker about a village or small town, let's say, outside of Moscow, that was popular with dissidents and literary figures in the Soviet period, and now is home to a local doctor who also writes short stories. And it's the story of a town, it's the story of this doctor who is a kind of Chekhov-like figure in that he practices medicine and writes short stories. And it's a, I guess, quaint, if that's not a bad word, story about life in rural Russia. Again, the kind of thing that didn't have to exist. There was no news context for that. The reader would never have noticed or wondered, why doesn't the New Yorker have a story, this week about life in this small town in Russia? I hope that through the characters and through the storytelling, I was able to make this place, the name of the town is Tarusa, that I was able to make Teresa come to life and justify itself as a story in the New Yorker, right? That there's something in the end interesting enough about this place that even though there's no news reason why you should be reading about it, still the reader is left feeling like they gained something, some interesting and just enjoyable information. So let me turn to the two topics mentioned in the title of this talk and the two big issues in Russia today. The first is particular, or rather the opposite. The first is universal and the second is particular to Russia. The first, of course, being the pandemic. I'll sort of briefly walk through how Russia has managed the pandemic. I would say the overarching kind of strategy or the overarching paradigm through which Russia has navigated the pandemic is a relative lack of control from on high. In other words, lack of strict quarantine or lockdown measures from the government, matched by an interesting and maybe surprising for some lack of fear from below. In other words, when you poll Russians or when Russians are polled about their relationship to the pandemic, you have much lower levels of, let's say, kind of anxiety or fear about the virus itself. This is going back, more than a year now, a year and a half. Coronavirus just frankly didn't frighten Russians like it did many other societies. Of course, there are all kinds of exceptions to that, and it's impossible to speak in generalities, but if we just look at the overall polling data, we do get some clues about how Russian society feels and relates to the pandemic. There are some interesting reasons for that. I had a conversation with a Russian demographer who pointed out to me that in the 90s, in the kind of chaos and poverty and violence at times of the years following this collapse of the Soviet Union, excess mortality, in other words, sort of how many more people per year are dying than normal or should, that Russia was the only country, excuse me, in the developed world that saw an increase of excess mortality in the period following World War II. In other words, every other country, certainly in Europe, the pandemic represents the first time that excess mortality has spiked in such a way since World War II. Russia saw even greater spikes of excess mortality in the 90s. In other words, the pandemic, just in terms of, let's take one metric, in terms of death, the pandemic was actually not the most destructive event to happen to Russia in the lifespan or in the memory of people who are alive today. In other words, there are many people in middle age or even younger who lived through the 90s and who lived through a period when more Russian people were dying than during the pandemic. And that's not the case for any other country in Europe. There's basically no one alive in Europe who has seen such numbers of excess mortality for their country. You'd have to find someone, the generation who still remembers and lived through World War II. One issue I wrote about in a long way for the New Yorker, and we can talk about in the Q&A if you like, is the Russian vaccine, Sputnik V. It seems to me, having visited the laboratory where Sputnik V was invented and also talking with independent scientists, including many in the West, it seems like Sputnik V is actually a quality product, seems to be a quality product. Trials from Argentina and other countries back that up. In other words, you don't necessarily have to believe, Russian statistics. You can look outside of Russia. It looks like Sputnik V, from a scientific perspective, works. In a way, that's no surprise. It's very similar in its construction to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, widely used in Europe and the United States. What seems to have happened with Sputnik was that it was a quality product undermined by a bad PR campaign. On the one hand, you had Putin announcing with great fanfare the registration of Sputnik V last summer, well before not even the phase 3 trial had ended. In fact, before the phase 3 trial had even started. That naturally led to a lot of skepticism about the vaccine. And also interesting, I've learned or heard from talking to Russian sociologists, is that the messaging inside Russia, as I mentioned, was perhaps less than ideal or maybe even sort of counterproductive, in that on state television or from state officials, the message heard from all kind of state bodies was that Russia has defeated the coronavirus. Russia has defeated the pandemic. This is, let's say, back last winter and spring, when on state media, the reports were full of, look at how countries in Europe are still in lockdown. There's still ongoing quarantine a year and a half later in Europe. Russia's open. Russia has defeated the coronavirus. That was the message. And Russia, because Russia has this great, world-beating vaccine, a really positive message, which you'd think could sound okay in terms of messaging or propaganda. But very convincingly, Russian sociologists have argued to me that the real message should have been: coronavirus is dangerous. You don't want to catch it. You should be scared of coronavirus, and that's why you should get vaccinated. In other words, the notion that Russia had defeated the pandemic, that Moscow was open, the cities were open, there was no lockdown. You could go to the opera, you could go to a nightclub, and then evening news was telling you about how great Russia's COVID response had been. We invented the vaccine, Russia's open, Europe's still in lockdown. That led to real complacency in the public and a lack of a desire in getting vaccinated. As the public continued to be relatively disinterested in vaccination, Russia has some of the highest, or rather I should say, Russia has some of the lowest levels of vaccination in Europe, some of the highest levels, if not the highest level of vaccine hesitancy or vaccine skepticism. And even as cases began to spike again this summer, as the Delta variant hit Russia, just like it has everywhere, leading to an immediate rise in cases. But in Russia, at the time, let's say no more than 30% of the population had been vaccinated. Even as cases continue to spike, and even as the death rate spiked, now reaching over 800 people a day, giving Russia one of the highest per capita death rates in the world. There's little political will for lockdowns. Interestingly, even in an autocratic system like Russia's, the political elite don't feel like they have the right or don't want to risk enforcing or enacting unpopular measures that would go against public sentiment. And in this case, with public sentiment against lockdowns, even in a autocratic system where the state can do as it pleases, we saw this last weekend with the parliamentary elections, which I'll talk about in a moment. Even in that kind of non-democratic system, the Kremlin still feels like it has to stay in a kind of lockstep with public opinion, and therefore is hesitant, or you might even say afraid, to go for more lockdown measures. And it's also, I believe, we don't have kind of, the Kremlin doesn't reveal its reasoning to us, but I believe is the reason why the Kremlin made a move toward mandatory vaccinations this summer and then ultimately backed away from it. I think that they made that move when the onset of the Delta variant seemed really worrying and potentially catastrophic for Russia. Then a few weeks later backed away from it when they realized there wasn't still a lot of public, or not the kind of public support for vaccination you would need. There's a lot of vaccine hesitancy. There were a lot of people who were upset about being forced to take the vaccine. And so the government didn't feel like it had that legitimacy or had that confidence necessary to enact or to stick with the mandatory vaccine policy. And leading to a situation in the current moment where Russia continues to have, in a per capita basis, among the highest level of daily spread in terms of new cases per day and also deaths per day. When averaged out over Russia's population, you could say that the pandemic is raging in Russia in a way that it is almost nowhere else in the world. And of course, that's a very worrying and tragic result for Russia with a great human cost. let me finish my introductory remarks before we get to the questions to talk about protests. And I'll try and move through those, move through that topic quickly. Over the decade that I have spent in Russia, I have seen and observed a steady consolidation of control by the Kremlin. Of course, Russia always had in the Putin era this quote unquote managed democracy. In other words, a kind of postmodern democracy in which the system nominally has parties, it has courts, it has all the trappings of democracy, but in fact, it's all managed behind the scenes by the Kremlin. That has been a feature of Putin's Russia, really going back to his first term, and one that has gathered strength over time, becoming more and more centralized, more and more tightly controlled. That has been a tendency happening over the decade I have been reporting in Russia. A turning point at which things got even more restrictive and in which repressions became even more kind of front and center was the poisoning of Alexey Navalny this summer, the leading opposition figure and politician in Russia. Before Navalny's poisoning, the state had effectively tolerated him, but by marginalizing him. And in fact, you might say somewhat successfully. Navalny ran for mayor of Moscow in 2013. He got nearly a third of the vote, which is a very good result, but at the same time, not nearly enough to present a real danger at the ballot box to the pro-Kremlin candidate who did win. And since then, his national popularity never really got above 5% or so. He was not a very popular figure nationally, but he did present nonetheless a danger to the Kremlin, I would say, for two reasons. One is he had a network of local field offices around the country, something like 100, and was really creating a grassroots political organization that existed outside of the state. And it didn't so much matter whether or not this grassroots organization was going to get Navalny into office one day. The odds of that seemed low. Navalny was never allowed to run. But as I said, his popularity nationally was actually low. But he was training people for bottom-up grassroots politics around the country and training people to coordinate within their communities, to spread the word within their communities. And that sort of activity, I think, was a real threat to the Kremlin. And they understood correctly that those are the kinds of skills and habits that could go beyond Navalny himself, and the people who were trained in his headquarters and kind of were introduced to politics through that kind of activity could then go on to other political activities that could present much more of a danger to the Kremlin. The other was Navalny's role, I would argue, as an investigative journalist through his investigations released on YouTube into corruption among figures of the inner circle around Putin. Those YouTube videos regularly got more views than does the evening news on state television in Russia. Navalny was becoming a media outlet in and of himself. And I think that spread of information was also understandably very worrying for the Kremlin. So that was another way in which he is more dangerous on YouTube, let's say, than he was as an actual political threat in terms of, could he take office? Would he be elected president? No, I don't think those are likely outcomes, but he could still really create a lot of problems and discomfort for Putin and the ruling elite. So he was poisoned in August. He then returned to Russia after being treated in Germany. He returned to Russia in January and was immediately arrested. That arrest kicked off protests. And the protests then led to, I would argue, an unprecedented crackdown against Russian society. We saw thousands of arrests across the whole of the country. We saw, let's say, kind of random protesters being arrested in numbers we hadn't before. The authorities were going after not just the leaders and the high-profile coordinators of protests, but everyday protesters, really trying to scare society by showing that anybody could get picked up and anybody could get a real jail sentence. Many of Navalny's associates, these local coordinators I talked about, were charged with one violation or another. Many choose to quit politics. Many others chose to leave the country entirely. At the same time, the authorities were cracking down on anything political and certainly anything having to do with Navalny's organization. They also launched a parallel crackdown against independent media. This law on so-called foreign agents that I mentioned earlier was expanded and used to go after an increasing number of independent outlets and even independent journalists, actual individuals, not just a media company or media outlet could be declared a foreign agent, but a single individual could be named a foreign agent. The first time that this law had been used in such a way, and this sounds like a sort of irrelevant or kind of not so impactful bit of legalese, but that foreign agent designation comes with a whole suite of bureaucratic and legal requirements that make the work of a media outlet very difficult. It also means that sources inside Russia are less likely to share information. But the designation of individuals, when a person becomes a foreign agent, that really creates an even greater burden on the individual, as they have to comply with all of these bureaucratic requirements, all of their income, all of their spending. As one newly minted foreign agent, told me, anytime she decides to buy a dress for herself, she should, inform the Justice Ministry and keep a record of her spending, which is, both very complicated and frankly humiliating. Did the state get what it wanted from that crackdown? In the short term, I think it's fair to say maybe yes. The Duma elections, the parliamentary elections from last week, in which the Kremlin was able to push through a winning slate for its, the pro-Kremlin ruling party, United Russia, with clear falsifications, with this sort of open manipulations, especially of the electronic vote in Moscow, without real repercussions in terms of protests or pushback. The opposition is scattered and demoralized. People with anti-Putin leanings, that's everyday people, right? Kind of rank and file protesters, let's say, don't see the point in going out to protest now, or are simply scared. And there's little resistance for increasing authoritarian consolidation by the state. That seems to be the short-term story. The long-term story is more interesting and more, I think, open. What's the plan? What does Putin and those around, and what do Putin and those around him want to do with this power they're consolidating? So far, it seems like the only vision is really to survive another day, right? It's power for its own sake. Russian politics tend to be very tactical, not so strategic. So Putin and those around him really are just trying to solve the question of, staying in power, today and tomorrow. We'll worry about the day after later. And so that day after question, I think, still is really open. Russia's institutions have been hollowed out over the years. There is no obvious replacement for Putin. And many of the powerful interests in politics and business kind of depend on Putin being this figurehead and arbiter who keeps the overall system stable and thus allows them to extract power and profit from it. Here I'm talking about well-connected cronies and insiders and officials from the security services. So there's a lot of powerful people who are invested in the continuation of the Putin system for their own interests. But how will that system evolve? Can that system evolve to meet changing economic and technological realities? The world is changing. It's hard to imagine a politician who came to office 20 years ago still having the skills and the kind of real feel for what politics and the economy and technology demands or also requires in the as the 21st century advances. So I think that'll be a real challenge for Putin. I'll close by saying, in the long term, for me, there are more questions than answers. I think back to that late Soviet period that I caught just a glimpse of as a small child. This system then looked outwardly stable. It seemed like the Soviet Union would continue forever. That was certainly the professional analytical opinion of many people who followed the Soviet Union. But this outwardly stable system then grew weaker, often, or in many ways weaker without people noticing from the outside. it buckled and then disintegrated much more quickly than anyone could have ever predicted or even prepared for. And I would say that's an outcome you should never bet on. The odds are the system won't collapse tomorrow, but nor do I think you can exclude it. And that's the kind of prism that I use myself, and I would encourage others to use in understanding, what the future holds for Putin's Russia. So with that, I'll say thank you for listening. I hope you found that interesting, and I'm looking forward to answering whatever questions you may have.
All right, so you guys get a question, and please join this website Slido, and you can see the code here 166160, and you can join and ask your question. All right, thank you guys for the first question. What requirements does a foreign correspondent need to comply with to work in Russia?
Sorry, actually, I couldn't hear. I don't know if you can speak a bit, maybe closer. I can't quite hear couldn't hear the question.
What requirements does a foreign correspondent need to comply with to work in Russia?
The thing about journalism as a job is that there really are no rules, and there's no requirement. It's not like being a lawyer or a doctor and having particular credentials. I think the real, and this isn't even 100% required, but I would certainly encourage, but the real skill to have is to speak Russian. And that's the case in Russia. If you're going to be working as a foreign correspondent in the Middle East, I would say speak Arabic, or in China, Chinese, and so on. But I think the language is really the thing that allows you to do your job and gives you access to the stories and people that you need to be able to bring Russia to life. Beyond that, there isn't really anything on a CV that you need to be a foreign correspondent. I mean, it helps, or I'd say it's also necessary to be able to write clearly, but that's the kind of thing that you can learn and pick up in lots of ways. You don't necessarily need a particular credential or diploma for that, but the combination of speaking Russian and then being able to write in a way that's understandable and interesting and smooth and clear really is all you need. And beyond that, some luck and a bit of kind of patience and a sort of stick with it attitude, and I think that's the formula.
All right. Does it answer your question? Whoever asked. Yeah, thank you, Gabor. All right. How do the Russians view the relationship with China today, especially compared to the relationship with the West?
I think that there's a lot of hope and investment among many Russians, especially, let's say, Russian kind of officials, Russian business people in the elite business and political elite in Moscow, that China will somehow replace the West, right? That as Russia and the West have grown further apart, as the West has put Russia under sanction and so on, that Russia can turn to China and develop business and also diplomatic ties with China. And that kind of is the case. That kind of works. China is happy for Russia to distance itself from the West and grow closer to it. I think that the hesitation or the kind of downside of this, which many people in Russia recognize, is that for today's China, Russia will always, frankly, be a junior partner, just given the size of the Chinese economy, given kind of China's role in the world. China is a rising power. Russia is a declining power. But Russia is a declining power that doesn't want to admit that, and in fact can never kind of acknowledge to itself or the world that it in fact is a kind of diminishing power. And that makes the relationship with China very difficult because, China will happily take advantage of the fact that Russia has worsening relations with the West, and please, let's sign deals, China will buy Russian gas if Europe is not. But of course, China will want to do so on terms that are most advantageous to it. And I think that makes Russia and Russians nervous about going into too close an alliance with China.
All right, thank you very much. You have been correspondent in Russia for many years now. Which story are you the most proud of?
That's hard to say, like choosing between my children, I guess. I would say this story about the medical train in the Far East, I quite like. I don't know if I'm the most proud of it, but that felt like a really unique experience that I understood most people wouldn't have. And I felt a real responsibility, a pleasure in being able to tell that story, and also responsibility because I was in a place that just most people, certainly reading the magazine, would not be able to get to. And so, again, I don't know if pride is exactly the word I would use, but I felt really lucky and really pleased that I could be in such a place. And as I said, also that made me feel really extra responsible for doing the story justice. It's not like some of the other stories I've written, even let's say stories from Ukraine, from Crimea, from during the Donbass war. There were so many journalists around, so many great journalists writing really interesting and important stories. If I missed something, somebody else would probably write about it. I didn't feel like I was certainly not the only person there, right? The opposite. You could read about the events in Crimea or Donbass in lots of magazines. You didn't have to read the New Yorker. But in that case of that story about the medical train in Siberia, you really did need to read that article, right? You weren't going to get it somewhere else. And so that feeling of uniqueness was both pleasure and gave me a bit of pressure.
All right, thank you very much. The next question is, why was a positive narrative of the vaccine less effective than a negative? Fear including one, if that is not too complicated a question to ask.
Well, I think if I understood the question, it turned out that having people feel like Russia had quote unquote defeated coronavirus made them think, well, what's the point in going to get vaccinated? Why go do this thing that many Russians were already, say, disinclined to do? There are already high levels of vaccine skepticism. Well, great. If the pandemic is over and we've won, why go do this thing that I'm already sort of inclined not to want to do? The opinion of these sociologists was that only a fear of the virus itself would get people to go become vaccinated, because otherwise, like I said, they feel like, well, what's the point? We're being told left and right that Russia has defeated coronavirus. We're open again. Like I said, you can go to a restaurant, you can go to opera, you can go to a nightclub. So why go through the trouble of doing this thing that you don't want to do?
All right. Does it answer your question, Sim?
Yes.
All right, awesome. You said that currently foreign journalists do not have to be afraid of repercussions. Do you think that this will change in the future?
I hope not. I'm certainly prepared for any development or kind of outcome in this regard, and it would be naive to think the situation will stay stable forever. But I do think that at the end of the day, like I talked about in another context, what matters for Putin and others in the ruling system is holding on to power. That's at this point is the goal, is the motivation, is the task. And articles in the New Yorker don't really threaten that because they're not part of the political conversation in Russia. They're not the sort of thing that on a large scale, Russians are not reading. So it remains outside of this, of the kind of civic and political discourse. So therefore, not really a threat. And then, therefore, by extension, we're left alone. Logic tells me that that logic should continue to hold, but experience in Russia shows me that of course it can change, and I should in some way be mentally prepared for that change if and when it does happen.
All right. Has the willingness of your local sources / people on the street to speak to you as a foreign correspondent changed over the years?
Interestingly and thankfully, no. I would, you could have thought that various moments, tensions with the West, sanctions, U.S. putting sanctions on Russia, whether it's about Crimea, Ukraine, election interference, all these accusations that Russia faces, the worsening of relations between Russia and the West. It would be logical if the answer was yes, and that I said yes, people are less willing or interested to talk to me. But again, so far so good. I hope this doesn't change, but no, I haven't actually found people changing in their attitude toward me. I do think that there's a great ability of Russians to distinguish between kind of official diplomatic relations and people-to-people relations. I think that like the question asks, whether it's my kind of sources or people on the street, I don't think they see me as an extension of the Trump administration or the Biden administration in the United States. And so I'm able to continue to do my work with more access than I might have thought, but so far that continues to be the situation.
All right, thank you for answering this question. The next one is, you talked about the pressure foreign journalists may or may not endure from Russian government. Have you ever been pressured by US in any way?
No, that's an easy one.
Short. There's a lot of people protesting on the streets against Putin, but in reality, when you talk to people, do you see there are still people in support of him?
What I've found in the past couple of years is there are less and less people who are, let's say, kind of raw, really enthusiastic Putin supporters. There are many, many people, perhaps still the majority, who kind of tolerate Putin, who feel like there's no better alternative. We don't want another revolution, who don't like Navalny. They don't see a credible, alternative politician, and don't want to risk, upsetting the system again. They don't want to go through another period like the 90s of instability and chaos after the collapse of a political system. Let's just keep things the way they are. Like, let's say, stability voters, right? But I see more and more stability voters, but less and less real, genuine Putin supporters. In other words, it's one thing to say, well, why not? Sure, let's keep Putin in power. I don't see a better option. Another thing to say, yes, I really love and support Putin. And those are the kinds of people who I really see less and less of in recent years.
All right. You said that foreign correspondents are usually left alone to do their job, but have you ever feel I'm sorry, I'm not sure about how to pronounce that, endangered, like ENDANG, endangered? Oh yeah, thank you. Doing your job.
Also an easy one. No, as so far so good. I hope that continues to hold, but no, I've never felt pressure or danger doing my job.
All right, great. Could you elaborate more on your strategy of interacting with local information sources? For example, how to get political information, even if there is political risks?
It's very difficult, frankly, to get political information. I have very few sources, almost zero, inside, literally zero, if we're talking about inside the Kremlin, people, high-ranking individuals who might tell me the secrets of Putin deliberations. I mean, no such people exist. Whereas my colleagues who work in Washington, D.C., for example, lots of people in the White House come out of meetings and then tell journalists what happened off the record. This doesn't exist in Russia. The advantage really is time in two senses. One, I've been there for now 9 years. So I have a good lay of the land. I know who to call on what story. I've worked with some sources on many stories. There are people I go back to time and again. So we develop a relationship of trust, and they see the result. In other words, they see my articles. It's hopefully, it seems like, many of them think the result is kind of accurate or professional or interesting. So, okay, so it's worth, sharing some information with Josh again. And over time, you develop relationships with people you can return to. The other question of time is that even in the context of one article, because it's the New Yorker in this particular format of these long reads, I have a longer amount of time to work on the article. So I can, I don't have to rush. I'm not calling people on deadline for a quote. I just need you to tell me this one thing and I have to get off the phone to write the article. That's not me. I can, sit with people for some time, for many hours. I can go back and see them again. So I think this kind of slow approach helps people potentially trust me, or at least kind of grow to know me enough that they're willing to share some information.
All right. What are the means of suppression for Russian journalists?
Lots, starting from economic. It's almost difficult, it's difficult, if not almost impossible, to be the owner of an independent media outlet in Russia today that sort of contradicts the official line. That's why so many of the new generation of Russian media outlets are formally registered abroad. So just from the beginning, off top, it's very difficult for financial regulatory reasons, to have your Russian media company based in Russia if you're going to criticize the Kremlin. We've seen the Kremlin force media outlets to change hands for owners to sell them to new owners who are more friendly to the Kremlin, who then replace top editors and other newsroom staff. There are, of course, physical threats. No one should downplay this risk. Thankfully, it's rare, but it happens enough where it's in the back of everyone's mind. It only needs to happen, every so often for people to be aware that this danger exists. Then there are these kinds of legalistic, bureaucratic measures like the foreign agent law, which sounds on the face of it, okay, who cares? You're called a foreign agent, unpleasant, but what changes? But in fact, everything changes. Advertisers don't want to be affiliated with a media outlet that is labeled a foreign agent. Sources don't want to give interviews or information to outlets that are labeled foreign agent. And even the individuals who are then given the foreign agent label, if they then want to go work at another media outlet that doesn't have this designation, well, they carry it with them. It's kind of like the scarlet letter, right? It sort of damns them for life. So that's another difficulty, both in the terms of the institution and also the individual and there are thousands more. Now, those are just, I think, some of the more relevant examples of why doing journalism in Russia can be so difficult.
All right. What is your view on China's Belt and Road Initiative in Central Asia, like in Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan?
I don't know that much about it, other than the fact of its existence, and that China certainly is investing a lot in this initiative. I mean, it's interesting that it's happening in Russia's backyard, and that I don't think Russia really has a way of not just stopping it, but Russia has no real strong counter proposal of its own. I think that initiative is a case of changing narratives in the region. Russia historically has had so much influence in Central Asia, going back to Soviet days, when the republics of Central Asia were part of the Soviet Union, ruled from Moscow. And so for more than a decade, several decades, I think you could say there was some kind of inertia in this relationship and this power dynamic. But now we're seeing it's being updated, it's changing. China is the more relevant and influential player in Central Asia, and even in its own backyard, quote unquote, Russia is somewhat being left behind.
All right, thank you. What's your opinion on the smart voting app from recent election being removed from Google and Apple? Are you surprised by the fact they gave in?
Yes, I think that is the biggest story of the recent parliamentary elections. The results of those elections, that united Russia gained another majority in parliament, is kind of, who cares? That's all very predictable. I think the big story was that the Western tech firms caved to Kremlin pressure. If indeed the reporting we have is true, the companies themselves have not confirmed this, but if the Russian authorities threatened to arrest specific local individuals who work for Google and Apple inside Russia, then of course those companies had a really difficult moral dilemma. But we haven't heard them speak about that directly. But I think that's a real watershed moment, that the fact that these Western tech companies agreed to censor content on Kremlin orders. I think that's seeing as they went for it this time, they effectively caved. I don't think that's the last time the Kremlin asks. I think this is now will be the beginning of a trend, and it'll be interesting to see, do they go along every time, and where do they try and draw a new line in the sand for what they won't do.
All right. Have you ever visited Chechnya? And what's your vision/opinion on the entire situation with Oblast? Also in relation with the attack in the Moscow airport.
I have visited Chechnya many times. I wrote a long New Yorker article about Chechnya that came out, I think, in 2017. Earlier, 2016. Anyone who's interested, the person who asked the question, if you're interested in Chechnya, perhaps you would find my article of interest. So I spent lots of time there. I then returned to Chechnya for a chapter set in Chechnya in my book. So I know the place fairly well, although I haven't been in some years. I knew it, I should say, fairly well some years ago when I was doing the article and then working on the book. And Chechnya is certainly a kind of a world in and of itself. It's you feel like you're in a very specific place that exists somewhat outside the kind of rules and motifs of the rest of Russia. It's a quite intense place that you could say kind of psychologically feels cut off or feels separate from the rest of Russia. It feels like its own little world state within a state. As for, I'm not sure how to connect it or how I should sort of connect it to the larger question of oblasts. I think that Chechnya is really an outlier. The tendency over the years has been for the regions to lose their autonomy and to become more and more beholden to Moscow. The narrative in Chechnya has been shifting the opposite direction. Chechnya, under the rule of Ramzan Kadyrov, has become more and more, effectively or de facto independent and has increased its autonomy from Moscow. So Chechnya really is an outlying case, but an outlying case that nonetheless kind of proves, I think, some of the important, or highlights some of the important traits and attributes of Putin's Russia.
All right. Did you notice any hint suggests Russia will or will not go into more authoritarian situation like China, for example, mass monitoring or blocking foreign journalists?
I think we're definitely headed in that direction. The events of recent months clearly show we're on that trajectory. It's not a question of if, it's maybe a question only of at what speed or what intensity, but that is the course Russia is on. Russia, as we just talked about in the previous question, is on a course to try and control more of the internet. It's certainly on a course to exclude any, not just opposition voices, but any even halfway critical voice from the political conversation or the political system. And it may, the question of kind of will it try and remove or crack down on foreign journalists, that's the one that's the biggest mystery to me. I don't know, maybe, it wouldn't be shocking. Nothing would be shocking at this point, but, Russia is very much on that trajectory already. Like I said, the only question is, with what speed and with what intensity it moves down that path, but that's the path it's on.
All right. In his investigations regarding his poisoning with Novichok, he said that smart voting was a large threat to the Putin regime. Could you elaborate?
Well, the fact that the Putin system went through such great efforts these last days to remove any mention of smart voting from these Western platforms and really, and not just in the App Store, but then going after it on YouTube, going after it on Google Docs, clearly the Kremlin sees it as a threat. It wouldn't be acting in such a way if it wasn't threatened by the smart voting initiative. It's unclear at the end of the day kind of what effect smart voting can have or would have. I mean, we're still talking about a political system that is very, very managed, very prescribed, not much choice, no real opposition candidates allowed on the ballot. So the best thing people can do is to try and coalesce around candidates who by no measure are liberal or oppositionist, anti-Putin, but just maybe not literally from the pro-Kremlin ruling party. But most of the candidates that smart voting recommended this last cycle were communists, right? So this is not like this is not a mechanism by which bold, young, new reformers get into Russian politics. But the fact that the Kremlin is so afraid of it clearly shows that they must, by definition, see it as a real threat.
All right. How do you go about choosing the topic you want to research and write about?
I just follow my own curiosity, really. I don't have a more set plan or program than that. I'm trying to stay up on the news to see what's happening in Russian politics and society, culture, to understand what are the important storylines, what are Russians themselves talking about, what's making the news inside Russia, what are my friends talking about, and then just you kind of know it when you see it, especially for a place like the New Yorker that has these more narrative, longer stories. When you find a particular story that allows you to tell a larger story, when you find this small story that has the relevance for a bigger story, well, you know it when you see it, and though that's the process is no more kind of prescribed, or there's no sort of step-by-step regimen by which I find stories. It's often just having an open and curious mind and following what's happening in Russia.
All right. How does the Russian public view the goal of restoring the Soviet Union? How do people there think about Crimea crisis and Transnistria, etc.?
I don't think there's much enthusiasm for restoring the Soviet Union. Nobody wants to go back to a time of poverty and breadlines and lack of international travel. I think people in Russia are pretty clear-eyed about actually being capitalist and liking their middle-class lifestyles. I think what people can, what can work on an almost emotional level is this idea of superpower relevance and superpower might, and that's where something like Crimea, I think, proved effective, at least in the short term. 5 years later, there's very little enthusiasm left over for the annexation of Crimea. This is not something that gets people really excited, but it did at the time. And so I think no one talks seriously about restoring the Soviet Union or anything along those lines. I think that is a non-starter. I think what can awake more emotional responses in people is this idea of Russia as a great power that matters in the world, that other countries have to listen to, that has influence over other countries. But I don't think there's any more interest at the moment in actual kind of expansionary or annexation moves like we saw in Crimea. I think that the Crimea operation proved that the effect from such events is short-lived, and there isn't a lot of enthusiasm for doing something like that anytime soon.
All right. What ways do you use to figure out the general opinion in Russia? For example, Russian social media, opinion polls, or just meeting people in real life?
All of it. First and foremost, though, reading Russian media. There is some really great journalism being produced in Russia, and I try and read Russian media every day, and also have friends who are Russian journalists who are very helpful. Using social media to follow stories. Opinion polls, actually, frankly, a bit less, but mainly just trying to be a consumer of news in Russia, not necessarily a producer. First and foremost, I try and kind of read the news and engage with the news just like a Russian might. And after that, determine for myself what I want to write about.
All right. Do you think Russians have a tendency in their mentality towards a dominant regime after the authoritarian regimes in the past and present?
No, I don't think there's anything kind of genetic about Russians and authoritarianism. I mean, I think that the question asker is right in that there isn't a lot of societal experience with democratic systems, and so maybe there isn't that kind of habit built into the system. But I don't think there's anything determinative about that. There's no reason why Russians. I think the notion that Russians prefer authoritarianism is wrong. I think that is what the Russian system that most Russians have known, and so there are certain kind of not just habits of mind, but just habits of how the system functions begin to develop. But I don't think there's anything that means that it has to be that way.
All right, you've mentioned that you've been living in Russia for like 9 years. I would like to ask you, what was your biggest challenge you faced for that time?
That's a good question. I think the biggest challenge is figuring out when it's time to leave. When have I had enough, both personally but also professionally? When is it time to try a new challenge, to try a new place? When do I want to think about relocating and taking on a new subject? I think Russia will always be interesting to me, so it's hard to pick this moment. But at the same time, sooner or later, maybe it is time for me to move on, and trying to gauge that moment, I think, is difficult for me.
All right, and you lived already for quite a while in Russia, and could you tell us like how Russia has changed through that period of time?
Yeah, I could try. It's become much more, especially a place like Moscow, St. Petersburg, right? These cities have really developed. They've become really, actually, even as the politics has gone in the opposite direction, Russia has become, or Moscow has become, a much more kind of fun, lively, even European, I would say, place to live. Great parks, great restaurants, great public transportation. And so like the surface experience of Moscow, at least in life in Moscow, has become much more pleasant and much more agreeable and nice in ways that I think, the bigger political story would make it sound like the opposite is true, but no. So I think that change has really been, I live it every day, right? As I live in Moscow. Besides, what I do for a job, I'm someone who takes advantage of what the city has to offer, and it has a lot. And I think that's the biggest change I've observed.
All right, thank you. I have also another question. Like you mentioned that being as an outsider is like kind of advantage, but also like I was wondering, is there any disadvantage? You as like foreigner, like as American journalist in Russia, like do you face like also kind of difficulties in that way?
Well, sure. And I didn't mean to sound so, I don't know, declarative in saying that earlier, that it's only an advantage. Of course, it's a disadvantage. There's lots I don't understand about Russia. There's lots I miss about Russia. My language is basically fluent, but still there are nuances and written texts that I can miss, and even in conversation. And yeah, I don't feel deep in my bones this historical, cultural context, and I think that could be nice in some cases, right? To not have to study some question, but to just know it. I think that would give me kind of certain perspective and confidence as a writer that I don't always have.
All right, and you mentioned like Russia is becoming, the main cities like St. Petersburg or Moscow, they're becoming more European. And I would like to ask you how Russian society perceives West. Like, is Russian society becoming more open, but they are still in a way quite conservative about like which issues like LGBT people, for instance?
Well, yeah, on issues that have become identified with kind of Western liberal societies like LGBT, Russian social attitudes still do tend to be rather conservative, but I would not say that Russia is an anti-Western place. I think there's still a lot of curiosity and even enthusiasm for the West, and you often find in polling that Russians say, they'd like their country to actually be closer to the West, to be closer to America. They want to see better ties with the outside world. So that's one way in which the Russian leadership, I think, is more anti-Western than Russian public itself. But that said, especially when you get out into the smaller regions and towns, in terms of social values, there can be some real kind of disconnect between Russia and the West. But nonetheless, I think that you see a real kind of aspirational attitude among many in Russia that they want Russia to be a European country, to be a Western country, and that's how they see themselves, and that's how they would like to see Russia.
All right, I have the last question. Like, what was the most surprising for you, like, for living so many years in Russia?
I think the most surprising thing, certainly at the beginning and maybe still now, is the degree of kind of closeness and intimacy and loyalty that you can have with Russian friends. The deep bonds of friendship here, like I mentioned, I came from Southern California. That's where I grew up, and Southern California is a place where everyone is cheerful, everyone is happy, everyone is smiling to each other and outwardly nice, but they aren't always available for a really deep connection, and maybe also aren't available in those moments when life gets complicated or difficult. They're there when everything is good and fun and it's sunny and it's great and we're all happy and healthy, but maybe don't know how to act in moments of crisis and moments of difficulty. And I found that Russian people can be something of the opposite, that they can be sort of a bit cold on the exterior or hard to penetrate, but then once they do reveal themselves to be extraordinarily loyal and generous and available for you in all of kind of life's moments, including those that are sort of sad or unlucky, and so on. And I found that the depth and intensity and loyalty of those relationships has been really wonderful, and I guess you could call it a surprise.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I would like to ask for upload to the speaker.
Thank you. I've lost the video. I can no longer see you. So I know you're all out there somewhere, but your screen for some reason went black a few minutes ago. I don't know what happened, but I guess I will sign off and say goodbye. Thanks everyone for the great conversation. Bye.
Thank you very much, guys, for joining our first ever lecture listening. I have a few announcements. First of all, like on Wednesday, we have running dinner. If you sign up, don't forget to come. It's gonna be very fun. On Friday, we're gonna open